Hello, and welcome back to another one of our relaxing and boring history videos, where we take you on a slow, peaceful journey through the past to help you unwind, rest, and maybe even drift off to sleep. So if you enjoy spending quiet moments with our calming stories, I invite you to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a single chapter. And while you are here, I would love to know from where in the world you are listening to this video and what time it is right now where you are. So please share with us in the comments section below, because it is always wonderful to see how far our quiet little corner of history travels across the globe. Winter in ancient China did not arrive suddenly, but rather drifted into the lives of rural peasants with a slow, deliberate presence, as if the season itself were a cautious traveler making its way down the long dirt roads that ran between rice paddies now empty of their golden harvest. The skies would begin to change first, shifting from the soft haze of autumn into a pale gray that seemed to stretch endlessly over the countryside, casting a muted light that made every color appear softer, every shadow more gentle. The air would grow cooler day by day, and in the quiet spaces between the sounds of animals and the faint chatter of neighbors in the distance, one could sense the approach of colder months, not as something to fear, but as a familiar and expected part of the yearly rhythm. For the peasants who worked the land, winter was not simply a time of rest, nor was it entirely a time of hardship. It was instead a period of careful balance, a season where survival depended upon the work done in the months before, where every bundle of millet stored, every bundle of firewood stacked beneath the eaves, and every jar of pickled vegetables, sealed with wax, held the promise of warmth, nourishment, and endurance. The land, once full of movement, would begin to quiet. Fields lay bare, their rows of stubble poking through a thin layer of frost that would melt slowly under the weak midday sun. The sound of footsteps on the hardened earth was different now, less a dull thud and more a crisp crunch, and in the early mornings, thin threads of mist would curl around the low stone walls of village houses, drifting lazily before dissolving in the daylight. In the heart of these villages, peasants prepared for winter, not with grand gestures, but with steady, almost ritualistic actions. The hearths were cleaned of old ashes and prepared for the steady burning of pine and willow wood, chosen not only for their availability but for the warmth and smoke they gave. Clay stoves, often built into the walls of the home, were checked for cracks and repaired with mud and straw mixtures to prevent precious heat from escaping. Thick quilts, made from many layers of patched fabric, were brought out from storage and aired under the pale sunlight. These were not fine silks, but sturdy, well-loved coverings, often handed down from generation to generation, each stitch telling the story of winters endured before. Food preservation had been an essential task in the weeks before the first frost, and now its importance became clear. In wooden barrels sealed tightly against moisture, turnips, radishes, and cabbage sat submerged in brine, slowly fermenting into tangy pickles that could last through the coldest days. Strings of garlic and onions hung from the rafters, not only for cooking but also to ward off illness in a time when medical care was scarce. In earthen jars, beans and grains waited to be cooked into hearty porridges, their mild flavors bringing comfort on long, dark evenings. Even tea leaves, carefully dried in the autumn, were stored in bamboo containers to keep out dampness, ready to be brewed into steaming cups that warmed both hands and spirit. The peasants understood that winter was not a season to be fought against, but one to live alongside. And so much of their preparation was about creating small pockets of warmth and comfort within the cold. The homes themselves reflected this understanding. Built low to the ground, and often with thick earthen walls, they retained heat more easily. Roofs were thatched tightly to keep snow from seeping in, and windows were sometimes covered with oiled paper to block the biting wind while still allowing in a soft, diffused light. Floors were kept clean and dry, sometimes lined with woven mats for insulation, and the family kong, a raised heated bed platform built of bricks or clay, became the center of life during the coldest weeks, heated from below by the stove's flue. Kong provided a space where the family could gather, share meals, tell stories, and sleep in relative warmth. Outside, the land might appear lifeless, but it was never truly still. Chickens and ducks, though fewer in number during the winter, still scratched at the frozen ground for scraps of food. Pigs were fed generously to ensure their survival, and, in some cases, to prepare for the midwinter slaughter that would provide meat for many weeks. The village dogs, their fur thickened by the season, patrolled the narrow paths with slow, deliberate steps, their breath forming little clouds in the cold air. Children, wrapped in layers of wool and cotton, played in the open spaces, their laughter rising like small bursts of warmth against the chill. They might slide on patches of ice, throw loose clumps of frost at one another, or simply follow the slow, steady movements of their elders, learning through observation the many quiet skills needed to endure the cold months. The sounds of winter in ancient China were different from those of other seasons. There was less shouting, fewer calls from the fields, and more of a low, steady rhythm. The creak of wooden gates, the muffled thud of an axe splitting firewood, the bubbling of soup in a clay pot over the stove, the faint whistle of wind through the bare branches of willow and poplar trees. At night, these sounds would fade even more, replaced by the quiet crackle of the hearth and the occasional call of an owl from somewhere beyond the village. Life slowed, but it did not stop. There were still chores to be done, water to be drawn from the well before it froze, livestock to be fed, clothing to be mended, tools to be repaired for the coming spring. Each task was done deliberately, without hurry, for there was little point in rushing when the days themselves moved so slowly. And always there was the fire, tended carefully, its glow casting long, flickering shadows across the walls, a reminder that while the world outside was cold and still, life inside continued in quiet, steady warmth. Winter, for the ancient Chinese peasant, was both a test and a teacher. It tested the work done in the seasons before, rewarding those who had prepared well with warmth and food, and challenging those who had not with long nights and thin meals. But it also taught patience, resourcefulness, and the value of community. Neighbors would check on one another, share a pot of hot millet porridge, or lend a bundle of kindling to someone whose fire had gone out. In these small acts, the cold was pushed back, not entirely, but enough to make it bearable. And so, as the frost deepened and the rivers froze over, life in the village continued, wrapped in the slow, steady rhythm of a winter that had come many times before and would come many times again. Each year, teaching the same quiet lessons of endurance, preparation, and the comfort of simple, shared warmth in the life of an ancient Chinese peasant. The hearth was not merely a place for cooking, but the living heart of the home, the quiet source from which all warmth, comfort, and nourishment seemed to flow during the long months of winter. And as the cold began to deepen, preparation for this central space became an act of both practicality and care, carried out slowly and deliberately in the days before the real grip of frost settled over the land. The first task was always to make sure that the hearth and the stove were in good working order, for without them, the home would be little more than a shell against the chill. And so the ash from the last burning of autumn would be carefully swept away with small, hand-bound brooms made from millet stalks, the fine gray dust rising into the air in soft clouds before settling again, a reminder of past fires that had kept the family warm through many nights. Any cracks in the clay stove walls were mended using a mixture of wet earth and straw, teased firmly into place and smoothed over with practiced hands that knew exactly how much pressure to apply so the repairs would last a season. Firewood, collected over many weeks, was stacked in neat, high piles in the driest corner of the courtyard. Each log split in advance so that no one would need to stand outside in the wind with an axe once the snow came. The peasants often chose different types of wood for different purposes. Dense hardwoods, such as elm or oak, would burn long and slow, perfect for keeping the Kong bed warm through the night, while lighter pine or willow, with its sweet, resinous scent, was ideal for quickly heating water or starting the day's first fire. Kindling was gathered in great quantity, bundles of twigs tied with old scraps of rope and kept under shelter so that no rain or frost could dampen them. In the kitchen area, clay pots and iron cauldrons were inspected for cracks, their surfaces wiped clean of soot, and utensils were placed where they could be easily reached, even on the darkest mornings. The home itself needed its own form of insulation, though the villagers would not have used such a term. Instead, they simply knew from long habit how to keep out the cold and trap in the warmth. Thick mats woven from reed or straw were rolled out along the floors to stop the icy air from creeping up from the ground. Windows, small and few in these simple homes, were checked for loose frames, and thin sheets of oiled paper were pressed carefully against them, letting in a soft, pale light while blocking drafts. The thatched roof, often worn from the rains of spring and summer, might be patched with fresh bundles of straw, tightly bound so that snow would slide off rather than melt into the rafters. Every part of the home had its role to play in keeping the family safe from the cold, and every repair made before the first snow was a promise to the days ahead that the season's hardships would be met with readiness. Clothing, too, was part of this preparation, and the women of the household would spend many days sorting through stored garments, checking for holes or worn seams that could let in the wind. Cotton jackets were padded with extra layers, often using scraps of cloth saved over years, for nothing was wasted. Woolen caps and scarves were laid out, and mittens were sewn for the children, their small shapes lined with rabbit fur or sheepskin if the family could afford it. Footwear was especially important. For winters, cold crept most easily through the ground into unprotected feet, and so straw sandals were thickened, or boots made from felt or leather were reinforced with extra padding. These tasks were done without fuss, without any sense of urgency, for they were as much a part of the seasonal cycle as planting in spring or harvesting in autumn. The work was done in the quiet hours of the day, often with a soft hum of conversation between family members, the clack of needles passing through fabric, and the low crackle of a small fire warming the room where they sat. In some homes, the Kong bed, that great heated platform where the family would gather to eat, rest, and sleep, received its own attention before winter's depth. The channels beneath it, through which the stoves, smoke, and heat traveled, were cleared of any blockage, and the surface was covered with fresh mats or quilts. The Kong was more than just a piece of furniture. It was the warmest place in the home, the center of family life, and its steady, radiant heat provided comfort beyond measure when the world outside lay frozen and still. Even the smallest children understood its importance, curling up there in the evenings with a piece of hot steamed bread in their hands, their cheeks glowing from the warmth that seeped up through the bedding. Outside the home, preparation continued. The courtyard was swept of fallen leaves and debris, for clatter could trap moisture and invite rot or pests during the cold months. Storage jars were checked to ensure their lids were tight, their contents safe from both dampness and animals seeking food. These jars held not only preserved vegetables and grains, but sometimes treasured treats, dried persimmons, honeycomb wrapped in wax, or small cakes made from glutinous rice and stored carefully for festival days. The peasants knew that winter, with its long nights and short days, required such small comforts to keep spirits high, and so they guarded them closely until the right moment came. Water, too, required thought, for in the coldest weather, the village well could freeze at the surface, making it difficult to draw. Some families stored large clay urns of water indoors before the frost came, ensuring they would always have enough for cooking and tea without having to break through ice. Each morning, the arrival of true winter. When the first heavy snow blanketed the fields and the wind began to howl against the walls, was met not with surprise, but with a calm acceptance, for the work had been done, the firewood was ready, the home was sealed against the cold, and the hearth was prepared to burn day and night if needed. In those moments, when the world outside was locked in ice and silence, the home became a place apart, a warm pocket of life sustained by the steady labor of many days and the wisdom passed down through generations. The peasants did not speak of it in grand terms, but they understood, in the quiet of their hearts, that this preparation was the foundation upon which winter survival rested. And so they worked with care, not only for themselves, but for their families, their neighbors, in the long chain of seasons that stretched before and behind them like the unending flow of the river beyond the village. For the ancient Chinese peasant, the act of preserving food for winter was not an afterthought, nor a hurried task performed when frost had already touched the ground, but a long, deliberate process that began quietly in the later days of summer and extended deep into the golden weeks of autumn, when the fields yielded their last abundance and the air began to cool, enough to signal that the time for gathering and storing was at hand. For in a world without refrigeration, without modern markets stocked year-round, and without the luxury of traveling far to find what the season did not provide, the only assurance of survival through the coldest months lay in what the family could prepare with their own hands before winter closed its grip on the land. The process was as much about knowledge as it was about labor, for each type of food required its own method, its own careful balance of time, temperature, and technique, to ensure it would remain safe to eat when the snow lay thick on the earth and nothing fresh could be harvested. Grains were perhaps the most important, and their harvest in late summer and early autumn was followed almost immediately by the work of drying them thoroughly. For even a trace of dampness could cause mildew or rot that would spoil an entire store. In the open courtyards of the village, millet, rice, and barley would be spread in wide, shallow layers on woven bamboo mats, turned gently by hand each day under the sun, the sound of grains shifting against the matting, a soft, dry whisper in the still air. Once the peasants judged the grains to be dry enough, they were gathered into large sacks sewn from sturdy cloth, or placed in earthen jars sealed tightly with clay and covered with straw, each vessel stored in a cool, dry place safe from the reach of mice or insects. Alongside grains, legumes such as soybeans and red beans were dried in a similar fashion, their smaller size making them quicker to prepare but no less valuable in the winter months when they could be boiled into nourishing soups or ground into flour for cakes and dumplings. Vegetables demanded a different approach. And here the peasant's skill in preservation became even more apparent. For these were more perishable and needed methods that could not only prevent decay, but also transform their flavor into something enjoyable during the monotony of winter meals. Cabbage, radish, turnip, and mustard greens were common staples, and many of them found their way into the tall wooden barrels used for pickling, in a process handed down through countless generations. The vegetables would be washed carefully in cold water, trimmed of any damaged leaves or blemished roots, and then layered with salt inside the barrel, sometimes with added spices such as Sichuan pepper or dried chili for warmth, or ginger to aid digestion. Once filled, the barrel would be covered with a wooden lid weighed down by a heavy stone, pressing the vegetables beneath their own juices to begin the slow, quiet work of fermentation. Over the weeks that followed, the salt would draw out water, creating a brine in which the vegetables softened, their flavors deepening into the tangy, savory taste that could brighten an otherwise plain winter porridge. Some families would preserve vegetables by drying rather than pickling, hanging sliced radish or strips of pumpkin on long strings, stretched between the beams of the home or beneath the eaves where the winter sun could touch them but rain could not. These dried vegetables, leathery to the touch, could be rehydrated in stews. Their stored summer sweetness released again in the warmth of the cooking pot. Meat was rarer for peasants, but in villages where pig or chicken might be slaughtered in the late autumn, nothing went to waste. Cuts of pork could be salted heavily and hung in the cold air to cure, the fattened meat slowly firming into something that could last for many weeks, while poultry was sometimes simmered in soy sauce and spices before being dried over the hearth, the smoke adding both flavor and preservation. Fish, where available from rivers or ponds, was often gutted, salted, and left to dry in the crisp wind until it became light and stiff, ready to be cooked into soups that carried the memory of warmer days. Even humble eggs could be stored for months if treated properly, preserved in ash, salt, or clay, creating the famous salted eggs that added a burst of flavor to otherwise simple fare. Beyond the essentials, there were the small, luxurious dried fruits, such as persimmons and jujubes, their sugars concentrating in the drying process until they became soft. Sweet treats that could be eaten as they were or added to festive dishes. Honey, when available, was kept sealed in ceramic jars, both as a rare sweetener and as a medicine for coughs and sore throats during the dry winter air. Tea leaves, gathered and dried in earlier months, were stored in bamboo tubes or paper-wrapped bundles, kept safe from dampness so they could be brewed into the fragrant infusions that warmed both body and spirit. The work of preservation was not simply practical, it was also deeply social, for many of these tasks were done together, with family members and neighbors lending hands, sharing tools, or trading knowledge about the best pickling methods, the right ratio of salt to vegetable, or the ideal number of days to leave meat hanging in the wind. In these shared labors, bonds were strengthened and the sense of community deepened. For everyone knew that while each household worked for itself, the survival of the village as a whole depended upon the collective wisdom and readiness of all. As the last of the harvest was brought in and the final jars sealed, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over the homes for the sight of neatly stacked firewood, the smell of fermenting vegetables, and the sound of grain shifting softly in its storage vessels were all signs that the season ahead, though cold and long, could be met with calm assurance. And when, deep in winter, a mother lifted the lid from a jar of pickled cabbage and the sharp, fragrant scent filled the air, or when a pot of millet porridge simmered with a handful of dried mushrooms and slices of cured pork, the effort of those long days of preparation will be felt again, not as toil, but as the warmth of foresight. The comfort of knowing that life could continue in quiet fullness, even when the land outside lay silent beneath the snow. In the rural villages of ancient China, where the winds of winter swept unhindered across the open fields and the rivers froze in long, silent ribbons of ice, clothing was not a matter of style or vanity, but a vital shield against a creeping cold that could sap strength and dull the will if left unchecked. And so, when the frost began to harden the soil and the first breaths of the morning rose in pale clouds from the mouths of farmers tending their animals, the work of preparing and layering clothing became an act as essential as stacking firewood or sealing jars of grain. The peasant's wardrobe for winter was born from necessity, shaped by the resources of the land and the skill of hands accustomed to making the most of whatever was available. And though these garments lacked the silken finery of the wealthy, or the ornate embroidery of court attire, they were made with the same care and attention to detail. For a loose stitch or a poorly fitted seam could mean the difference between warmth and chill in the heart of January. Cotton, where available, was the most valued material for padding, its soft fibers trapping heat when stitched between layers of cloth. And so, in the weeks before the cold set in, women of the household would gather the stored bolls of cotton, and begin the slow process of fluffing and spreading them evenly across large panels of fabric. These panels were then stitched together in patient, repetitive lines, forming jackets and trousers thick enough to keep out the wind, but flexible enough to allow for work in the fields or at the hearth. The outer fabric was often made from coarse hemp or homespun cotton cloth, its durability ensuring that the garments would last not just one winter, but several if mended carefully. Beneath these padded layers, undergarments of lighter cotton or linen were worn, their smooth texture preventing chafing and their ease of washing making them a practical base layer. In especially cold regions, multiple layers were worn together, the air trapped between them adding to the insulation, and though this made movement slower and bulkier, it was a small price to pay for the comfort it brought in biting winds. For those who could afford it, wool or sheepskin lined the innermost layers, the natural fibers adding extra warmth. But for most peasants, such luxuries were rare, and they relied instead on ingenuity, using whatever scraps of cloth could be salvaged from older garments. Sometimes even sewing in dried plant fibers or old quilt batting to fill gaps where cotton was scarce. Footwear was equally important, for the ground itself seemed to steal heat from the body in winter, and so shoes were padded with thick layers of cloth or lined with straw for insulation. In regions where winters were harshest, boots made of felt or leather were worn, sometimes wrapped in strips of cloth to further guard against snow and ice. Sandals woven from straw, though common in warmer seasons, were unsuitable for the cold, yet they were sometimes adapted by stuffing them with cloth or wool and wearing them over thick socks to provide at least some protection when heavier footwear was not available. Socks themselves were sewn from sturdy cloth, often reinforced at the heel and toe to withstand daily wear, and in the evenings they might be hung near the hearth to dry, the faint smell of wood smoke clinging to them by morning. Hands, too, needed their own covering, especially for work outdoors, and mittens or gloves were fashioned from scraps of padded fabric. Their simple design prioritizing warmth over dexterity. For fine tasks such as mending nets or tying bundles of kindling, the mittens could be slipped off briefly, but they were always kept close by. 4 numb fingers were not only uncomfortable, but dangerous in a season where every tool and every piece of stored food was precious. Cake coverings were another layer of defense, for much warmth could be lost from an uncovered head. And so caps made from quilted fabric or fur were worn, sometimes with ear flaps that could be tied under the chin on windy days. Scarves or long strips of cloth were wrapped around the neck and lower face when the air grew sharp enough to sting the skin. And in the most bitter weather, only the eyes would remain uncovered, blinking slowly against the cold. A tie, the making and maintaining of winter clothing was a task woven into the rhythm of daily life as the season approached. In the evenings, after the day's outdoor work was done, families would sit together near the warmth of the Kong bed or hearth, and the steady sound of needle and thread passing through fabric would mingle with the quiet murmur of conversation. Worn garments from previous years were brought out, inspected for damage, and repaired where possible, for nothing could be wasted, and a well-mended jacket could last many more winters. Children's clothing was often pieced together from the remnants of adult garments, resized and adjusted as the child grew, and though the colors might be mismatched and the seams plainly visible, these clothes carried the warmth of care stitched into every line. The smell of freshly laundered and dried winter clothing, often hung briefly in the pale winter sun before being brought inside, was a subtle comfort in itself, a clean, crisp scent that seemed to promise readiness for the cold nights ahead. There was a certain ritual to dressing for winter each morning. The first layer, cool to the touch, would be pulled on in the dim light of dawn, followed by the thicker, padded garments that had been folded carefully near the Kong to retain some of the night's warmth. Scarves would be wound around the neck, shoes pulled on and tied, mittens slipped over chilled fingers, and caps settled snugly over ears before stepping outside into the frosted air. The act of layering was not rushed, for each piece had its place and purpose, and the care taken in dressing was itself a reminder of the season's demands. Once dressed, a peasant could move through the tasks of the day, feeding animals, drawing water, tending the fire, with the quiet assurance that they were protected against the worst of the cold. And when the day's work was done, and the layers were shed again in the gentle warmth of the evening hearth, the weight of the garments was replaced by the lighter weight of rest. The body grateful for both the shelter of the home and the armor of cloth that had carried it through the hours. In this way, clothing in ancient China was more than a necessity. It was a form of quiet resilience, a barrier between the human warmth of the body and the vast, unfeeling cold of winter, crafted with patience, worn with gratitude, and passed down through years and generations as both a practical tool and a testament to the enduring wisdom of those who had lived and endured before. When winter settled fully upon the countryside of ancient China, bringing with it days where the sun was pale and low in the sky and the fields lay quiet beneath a thin crust of snow, daily life for the peasant did not stop, for even though the rhythm of the seasons slowed the pace of work, there were still many tasks to be done, and these tasks, though perhaps less urgent than the frantic planting of spring or the heavy harvest of autumn, were no less important to the well-being of the household, for they formed the quiet backbone of survival during the frozen months. The mornings began in darkness more often than not, the first pale light of day breaking only after the family had already risen from the warmth of the Kong bed, wrapping themselves in thick padded layers before stepping into the main room, where the embers of last night's fire still glowed faintly beneath a layer of ash. The first task was always to rekindle the fire, for without its warmth the home would quickly grow cold, and so a small handful of kindling would be placed upon the embers, coaxed into flame with careful breaths. The crackle of new firewood slowly filling the room with the comforting scent of smoke. Once the fire was going, water would be set to heat in a clay or iron pot, for hot water was needed for washing faces, brewing tea, and preparing the morning meal. Breakfast was often simpler, bowl of millet or rice porridge, perhaps with a few pickled vegetables or a scattering of preserved beans, and it was eaten while the family discussed the day's tasks, each person knowing what must be done and in what order. For the men of the household, much of winter's work took place outdoors despite the cold, for animals needed feeding, fences needed mending, and firewood needed to be brought in from the courtyard. If the family owned oxen or a mule, their shelter would be cleaned of old straw and fresh bedding laid down to keep them warm and dry. For healthy animals were essential to spring planting. Chickens and ducks were fed grain, and their coops checked for drafts that could harm them in the frigid air. The pigs, often kept in small pens near the home, were given a warm mash made from boiled vegetable scraps and grain husks, their snuffling and contented grunts breaking the stillness of the morning. For women, much of the work during winter took place indoors, though this did not make it any less demanding. Clothing needed mending, quilts needed patching, and supplies had to be checked regularly to ensure that no dampness had spoiled the stored food. The large storage jars of pickled vegetables and grains were inspected for signs of pests or mold, their lids adjusted if necessary, and their contents stirred or rearranged to keep them fresh. Meals, though simple, still required careful preparation, and the smell of simmering soups and stews often filled the air during the middle of the day, providing both nourishment and warmth as the steam rose from the pots and drifted through the small kitchen spaces. Children, when not helping with minor chores, spent time learning from their elders, practicing sewing stitches, helping to sort beans or clean vegetables, or, for the boys, learning to tie rope or carve simple wooden tools. These skills, though small in themselves, were essential building blocks of self-sufficiency. Spend winter's slower pace provided the perfect time for such teaching. Outside the home, the village itself had its own life, even in the depths of winter. Neighbors would greet each other on the narrow, frost-covered paths, stopping to exchange a few words about the weather, the health of their animals, or the state of their firewood supplies. On certain days, when the weather was clear and the wind.com, men might work together to repair a shared structure, such as a footbridge over a stream or the low wall that marked the edge of the village. These communal efforts, though not frequent, were important for maintaining the connections between households. For, in times of deep snow or illness, it was these bonds that often meant the difference between hardship and relief. There were also small trades and exchanges, for not every family produced or preserved the same foods, and one household might trade a jar of pickled turnip for a bundle of dried mushrooms, or a length of woven cloth for a few cuts of cured pork. These exchanges brought variety to the winter diet and strengthened the sense of interdependence within the village. Water was another daily concern, for in the coldest weeks the surface of the well might freeze overnight, and the men would take turns breaking the ice in the early morning, lowering buckets into the dark, cold water below. Some families kept a store of water indoors in large clay urns, but these had to be used sparingly to last between trips to the well. Laundry, too, could not be ignored, though in winter it was a more difficult task. Clothes were washed in cold water, sometimes warmed slightly on the stove, and then hung to dry indoors near the hearth, where the smoky warmth would gradually remove the damp. The smell of drying clothes mixed with wood smoke was a familiar one, carrying with it the sense of a home kept in order despite the hardships outside. As the day progressed, work would shift according to the weather. On days when the wind was too fierce or snow was falling heavily, more time would be spent indoors, weaving mats from reed or straw, repairing tools, or grinding grain into flour with a stone mill. On clearer days, men might venture into nearby wooded areas to gather more firewood, pulling sleds or carts loaded with logs back to the village, their breath rising in great white plumes against the cold air. The afternoon meal was usually the day's heartiest, providing the energy needed to complete the remaining tasks before darkness fell. As the light began to fade, animals were checked again, their shelters secured against the night's cold, and the last of the day's water was drawn from the well. Indoors, the fire was stoked, extra quilts were laid out on the kang, and any tools used during the day were cleaned and stored neatly for the next. Evenings were quieter. The family gathered together in the warmest part of the home, sharing a simple supper and perhaps a few stories or songs. Sometimes neighbors would visit, bringing news from other parts of the village, or simply enjoying the warmth of another's hearth. In the stillness of winter nights, when the wind howled outside and the snow lay deep over the land, the steady rhythm of these daily chores and routines provided not only physical survival, but also a sense of stability and continuity. It's a reminder that even in the harshest season, life went on in its patient, enduring way. In the heart of every peasant home in northern ancient China during the long, bitter months of winter stood two things that were far more than mere furnishings: the Kong bed and the hearth, each of them central to the comfort, survival, and rhythm of daily life in a season where the cold could be relentless, seeping into every crevice and slowing the pulse of the countryside to a quiet endurance. The Kong bed, more than just a place for rest, was an ingenious structure built from brick or clay, raised slightly above the ground and hollow within. It's designed to carry heat from the small stove or hearth fire beneath or at its side through internal flues that spread the warmth evenly across its surface. During the day, it was a place to sit, work, and gather. At night, it became the sleeping platform for the entire family. It's layered with thick quilts and padded bedding, so that even when the air in the room turned frosty, the surface of the Kong would remain warm and comforting beneath tired bodies. The hearth, meanwhile, was the source of that heat, a low, humble structure of clay or brick in which wood, crop stalks, or dried animal dung could be burned to create a steady warmth and a place for cooking. Together, the kang and the hearth were the beating heart of the home's winter existence, drawing family members close, not just for warmth, but for companionship, for shared meals, for the quiet work of sewing, weaving, or repairing tools, and for the long, gentle conversations that unfolded in the calm light of evening. On a winter morning, after the first stirrings of wakefulness beneath layers of bedding, the first task was always to revive the fire that kept the kang warm, for through the night the embers would fade, and, without attention, the bed would begin to lose its heat. A small, crackling fire would be coaxed back to life with careful hands, feeding it with dried twigs or crop husks until the flames licked higher, their heat flowing through the flues beneath the bed to warm its surface once more. While this was happening, water might be placed on the hearth to warm, filling the room with a faint mist as the first steam began to rise. The kang was more than warmth, it was a stage for much of the household's winter activity. Children might sit there to sort beans or husk dried corn, their legs tucked beneath them as they worked with quiet focus. Elders would rest there during the day, their hands busy with tasks that could be done indoors, such as twisting cord from hemp fibers or patching worn clothing. Women would sometimes kneel on its edge to roll out dough for noodles or dumplings, using its broad, stable surface as a work table. In the afternoons, with the winter light slanting through the small windows, the kang often became a place of stillness, where someone might take a short nap, warmed by both the bed and the murmur of conversation from others in the room. Even the arrangement of the home itself was shaped by these two central features. The kang was usually positioned along one wall, often with its head against the side farthest from the door to protect it from drafts, while the hearth stood nearby, close enough to channel heat through the kang's flues, but also accessible for cooking. Between them, they created a zone of warmth that became the natural gathering space for the family, especially in the early evenings when the day's outdoor chores were done, and everyone could retreat into the comfort of the home. Meals taken near the hearth were never rushed. In winter, the pace slowed, and people lingered over hot bowls of millet porridge, soups rich with preserved vegetables, or dumplings filled with a mixture of pickled greens and scraps of pork. The scent of the food mingled with the faint smokiness of the hearth, a smell so familiar and constant that it formed part of the season's very identity. The kang also served as a kind of shared memory space. In the deep cold of night, when winds rattled the wooden shutters and snow hissed softly against the roof, families would lie together beneath heavy quilts, sometimes 3 generations sharing the same bed, the warmth of bodies adding to the heat from below. In that closeness, stories were told, tales from the past, moral lessons, family histories. These conversations, whispered in the dim light of an oil lamp, wove a sense of continuity that carried through the coldest days. The hearth played its own role in memory, for its fire was not just for heat or cooking, but for small rituals of comfort, toasting a handful of seeds to snack on, boiling water for tea to be sipped slowly while watching snow fall beyond the window, roasting sweet potatoes in the ashes until their skins split and the air filled with their sweet, earthy scent. These moments, simple though they were, gave winter its quiet pleasures and softened the hardship of the season. Maintaining both kang and hearth was a task in itself. The flues of the kang had to be kept clear of blockages so that heat could travel properly. Ash from the hearth needed to be removed regularly, both to keep the fire burning efficiently and to avoid smoke filling the room. The fuel for both was gathered and prepared in advanced stacks of dried corn stalks bundled in. The courtyard Neat piles of split firewood arranged under cover. Baskets of dried dung cakes stored where they would stay dry and ready. In times of especially bitter cold, when the wind outside howled and the air was sharp enough to sting the skin. The kang and hearth were not just comforts, but necessities. It's a thin line between life and the deadly chill that crept through the land. It is perhaps difficult, in a world of modern heating and electric light, to understand the depth of reliance placed upon these humble structures. But for the peasants of ancient China, they were as essential as food or clothing, and their warmth was bound up with feelings of safety, family, and home. In the soft glow of firelight, with the crackle of burning stalks in the hearth and the steady warmth of the kang beneath, winter could be endured not as a time of endless hardship, but as a season with its own rhythm, a time for gathering close, for working with the hands, for telling and retelling the stories that would be carried into the next year. In the long, unyielding winters of ancient rural China, when the frost clung stubbornly to the fields and the rivers lay under a brittle skin of ice, survival depended as much on foresight as on endurance. And perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the preparation and preservation of food. The cold months did not allow for the easy gathering of fresh greens or the harvest of ripened grains. Instead, families lived on what they had carefully stored, dried, salted, fermented, and set aside during the warmer seasons, their skill in doing so determining not just the quality of their meals, but sometimes the very possibility of surviving until spring. Before the first snow had fallen, the air of the village would already have been filled in late autumn with a sense of food being prepared for the months ahead. Rows of long, pale radishes, pulled fresh from the soil, would be washed, sliced, and strung on cords to hang under the eaves, their flesh gradually losing moisture in the crisp, dry air until it became leathery and durable, ready to be softened in stews or soups when needed. Cabbages, their broad leaves still holding the last warmth of autumn, would be stacked in careful mounds in earthen pits or storage sheds, their outer leaves forming a protective layer against the frost, allowing the inner leaves to stay fresh well into the coldest part of winter. Grains were perhaps the most fundamental of all the millet, wheat, or barley harvested months before now sat in heavy sacks or clay jars, safe from dampness, each handful representing a portion of porridge, noodles, or steamed buns that would provide the dense energy needed to work and stay warm in the freezing air. Meat, when it was available, required even greater care. In poorer households, it might be reserved for special occasions or the rare communal feast, but when it was preserved, it was often done so through salting and drying. Strips of pork or mutton would be rubbed with coarse salt, sometimes spiced with crushed Sichuan peppercorns or bits of garlic, then hung in a cool, airy place where the cold wind would firm the flesh and carry away any hint of spoilage. Fish caught from rivers before they froze were gutted, cleaned, and dried on racks, their silver scales taking on a pale frost under the winter sun. Fermentation was another cornerstone of preservation, and it lent the winter diet both variety and depth of flavor. Soybeans, boiled and left to ferment, became pungent pastes and sauces that could be stirred into broths or spread thinly on flatbreads, their salty richness transforming otherwise simple fare into something satisfying. Vegetables like mustard, greens, or turnips were submerged in brine-filled jars, weighted down so they remained beneath the liquid, slowly changing over weeks into tangy, crisp pickles that cut through the heaviness of starches and meat. These jars would often line the shelves of a storage room or sit along the kong bed's edge where the gentle warmth could encourage the right level of fermentation. And their lids, when lifted, released aromas that were at once sharp, earthy, and oddly comforting. In the deepest part of winter, when the air outside bit at exposed skin and the snow lay in deep drifts against the walls, meals became an anchor of the day, their preparation a kind of quiet ritual. A pot of millet porridge might simmer slowly over the hearth from morning until the household rose from their quilts, its pale grains swelling and softening into a thick, creamy consistency that offered both warmth and a gentle start to the day. For lunch, a simple noodle soup might be prepared, the broth richened with a ladle of preserved vegetable brine, a handful of dried greens rehydrated in the hot liquid, and perhaps a sliver or two of cured meat to perfume the bowl. At dinner, the cooking might grow more elaborate, not in the sense of expensive ingredients, but in the time and attention given to coaxing depth from humble foods. A large clay pot could be filled with chunks of cabbage, slices of dried radish, a scattering of soybeans, and a bone or two saved from a previous meal, left to simmer for hours until the vegetables softened into the broth, their flavors mingling in a way that spoke of patience and care. One could imagine sitting near the hearth as such a pot bubbled quietly, the steam clouding the small window while the scent spread through the room, mingling with the faint, smoky sweetness of the fuel being burned. Special treats found there, way into the winter diet as well, often tied to the rhythm of festivals or important days. On the eve of the Lunar New Year, for example, dumplings might be made in abundance, their dough wrapped around fillings of finely chopped pickled greens, mixed with tiny bits of minced meat. The sealed crescents then boiled in large pots until they floated to the surface. Such meals were more than nourishment. They were reminders of celebration, of the turning of the year, of hope for the spring to come. Even small indulgences were treasured. Sweet potatoes, roasted in the ashes of the hearth, would be turned carefully until their skins split, releasing a caramelized aroma that promised a bite both soft and sweet, a little luxury in a season defined by restraint. Tea, too, played its part, though often it was not the fine tea of wealthy households, but a simpler brooper, perhaps dried chrysanthemum flowers steeped in hot water, or a handful of roasted barley grains dropped into a clay teapot to produce a warm, toasty drink. The act of pouring and sipping tea was as much about comfort as it was about taste. A chance to wrap cold hands around a warm cup and pause for a few quiet moments. The preserved foods not only provided variety, but also spoke of the season's interconnectedness with the rest of the year. Every jar of pickles, every bundle of dried greens was a reminder of the labor done under warmer skies, the harvesting, washing, slicing, salting, and storing that had filled autumn days with purpose. There was a satisfaction in knowing that the careful work of months before was now sustaining life in the harshest of times. This reliance on stored and preserved food also fostered a particular kind of creativity in the kitchen. 4 cooks learned to transform the same base ingredients into many different dishes, altering textures, seasonings, and methods to keep meals from becoming monotonous. A dried radish, for example, might one day be chopped fine and stir-fried with a bit of oil and soybean paste, its chewy texture and savory flavor pairing well with a bowl of rice. On another day, it could be sliced thin and simmered until tender, in a broth with cabbage and tofu, producing something entirely different in taste and feel. In this way, the winter kitchen was a place of subtle invention, where resourcefulness was valued as much as abundance. Through it all, meals remained slow affairs. The cold discouraged haste, and eating together near the hearth was as much about companionship as it was about filling the stomach. Bowls would be refilled without rush, conversation drifting between practical matters, how much grain remained, whether the snow might melt enough to draw water from the well in softer topics, such as stories from the past or musings about the coming spring. The rhythm of these meals, unhurried and steady, matched the pace of the winter itself, where days were shorter, but somehow seemed to stretch in their quiet repetition. And always, beneath the flavors and scents, there was the underlying knowledge that these meals were a triumph over the season's challenge, the result of foresight, labor, and the ability to adapt. In a world without markets overflowing year-round, without quick transport or refrigeration, To sit down to a warm bowl of food in the middle of winter was to taste the skill and patience of months past, and to feel, even in the cold, the steady reassurance of survival. In the frozen stillness of an ancient Chinese winter, where the wind carried not just cold, but a fine dusting of ice that stung the cheeks and numbed the fingers. The matter of clothing was far more than a question of style or presentation. It was a question of survival, of maintaining warmth in an environment that seemed to press against the skin from every direction. Finding any gap, any weakness in the layers that stood between body and frost. Clothing in those rural peasant communities was the result of both tradition and necessity, shaped by the materials that could be grown, raised, or traded for within a limited reach, and each garment told a quiet story of labor, adaptation, and the patience of the women and men who made them. Before the first serious frost, families would already have begun preparing their winter wear, often reworking the garments of the previous year, patching worn spots, replacing frayed ties, or sewing in new layers of padding. The most common fabrics came from plants and animals familiar to the village's: cotton, hemp, ramie, and wool from sheep or goats if they were available, though in the colder northern provinces, even scraps of felted wool from old, worn clothing could be stitched into linings to trap heat. Cotton batting, when it could be obtained, was especially prized for its insulating properties. Quilted jackets and trousers, known in later centuries as mian and miancour, the winter standard. Their layers of fabric stitched around thick padding to create a soft but dense barrier against the cold. The quilting stitches themselves were not merely functional. They were often sewn in small, repeating patterns, each one helping keep the cotton evenly in place, preventing it from bunching or leaving thin spots where the wind might find its way in. Beneath these heavy outer layers, people wore long-sleeved undershirts and trousers made of lighter fabrics, often rough to the touch, but comforting in their familiarity. These base layers absorbed sweat, which was important, for in the bitter cold, moisture against the skin could quickly become dangerous. Socks were often made from the same materials as undergarments, cotton or hemp, sometimes with an extra layer of cloth wrapped around the feet before shoes were put on, creating a kind of improvised insulation. The shoes themselves were often simple cloth-soled types for those who could not afford leather. But in winter, they would be padded with straw or lined with scraps of felt to protect against the frozen ground. In wealthier households, fur-lined boots might appear, made from rabbit, fox, or sheepskin, but in the humble homes of peasants, such luxuries were rare. Fur, when available at all, was usually reserved for hats, collars, or mittens, where it could provide the greatest benefit with the smallest amount of material. Hats were a winter essential, for heat lost from the head was keenly felt in those days of outdoor labor in unheated rooms. Many peasants wore thick, padded caps that tied under the chin, their ear flaps covering not just the ears, but part of the jaw and cheeks. In harsher climates, these might be lined with fur or stuffed with extra batting. Scarves or neckcloths were common, often nothing more than a long strip of cloth wound around the neck and tucked into the collar to keep drafts at bay. For hands, mittens were more efficient than gloves, as keeping the fingers together helped preserve warmth. They were usually sewn from fabric remnants and lined with cotton or felt, and they could be tied to the sleeves with short cords to prevent them from being lost in the snow during work. Dressing for the cold was not done in haste. In the morning, the process of layering could take time, as each garment had to be tied or fastened correctly to avoid discomfort later in the day. Strings or cloth ties were more common than buttons, and the art of tying them securely but without creating tight spots that restricted blood flow was one learned over years. The outer quilted garments were often heavier than the body might wish to carry indoors, but they were indispensable once a person stepped outside, for even a short walk to the well or the animal pens exposed them to air so sharp it seemed to pierce the skin. Indoors, clothing was adjusted to the conditions. Heavy outer layers might be shed while sitting near the Kong bed's warmth, but the inner layers stayed on, for the heat of the bed did not reach far, and the walls themselves often radiated a kind of slow, persistent chill. Repairs were constant during the winter months. A small tear in a jacket, if left unattended, could let in drafts that chilled the whole body, so sewing needles and thread were kept close at hand. Women often worked on mending in the evening hours, sitting by lamplight with a pile of clothes on their lap, their fingers moving steadily through fabric grown soft with years of wear. Children's clothing, in particular, required frequent adjustment as they grew quickly, and garments had to be let out, patched, or replaced entirely, sometimes made from the cut-down pieces of their parents' older clothes. This cycle of making, wearing, repairing, and remaking meant that garments carried with them a history. Stitched lines where an old seam had been taken in, faded patches from a long-ago winter, even the faint scent of smoke from nights spent near the hearth. The philosophy of winter clothing was simple but effective: trap heat, block wind, and keep dry. Yet, within that simplicity, there was variety. In some regions, peasants made use of felted wool, not just in linings, but in entire garments thick, almost armor-like coats that resisted both wind and wet snow. In others, especially in milder southern areas where extreme cold was less common, winter wear might consist of several lighter layers that could be adjusted throughout the day, reflecting the more variable climate. Clothing also followed the rhythm of daily work. A farmer heading into the fields for winter tasks, gathering firewood, tending animals, repairing tools would dress differently than someone spending the day weaving, cooking, or doing indoor carpentry. Outdoor work required garments that could withstand rough movement and exposure, often older and more worn pieces that could be dirtied or torn without regret, while indoor work allowed for cleaner, sometimes slightly lighter clothing. Yet even indoors, it was rare for a peasant to be lightly dressed in winter. The cold seemed to seep through cracks and floors, making warmth a matter of constant attention. At night, heavy outer garments might be removed. The sleeping clothes were still substantial thick. Long robes or multiple layers worn under quilts on the Kong bed, showing that no part of the body was exposed to the chill air while sleeping. In especially cold areas, people sometimes slept in their daytime clothing to avoid the discomfort of changing in freezing air. The making of winter garments was often a communal process in families, with each member contributing according to their skill. Children might be tasked with carding cotton or untangling yarn, older members with cutting fabric, and the most skilled with sewing or quilting. These activities often began in earnest after the harvest was complete, filling the late autumn and early winter evenings with the soft sound of cloth being handled and the occasional murmur of conversation. The knowledge of how to construct effective winter clothing was passed down through generations, not in written manuals, but in demonstration and repetition. A daughter learned from her mother how to quilt a jacket so that the cotton batting did not shift after washing, or how to pad the soles of shoes with straw so that the feet remained warm without becoming too tight. A son learned from his father how to tie the ties of his coat so that they would not come undone while hauling wood, or how to adjust a scarf so that it covered the nose without making it hard to breathe during labor. In all of this, there was a quiet resilience. Khan was accepted as part of life, and the work of dressing against it became simply one more element of the season, approached without complaint, but with care and thoroughness. The clothing worn by ancient Chinese peasants in winter was rarely beautiful by the standards of fine silk or embroidery. Yet, in its durability, practicality, and the comfort it provided, there was a kind of beauty, all its own a beauty of function, of familiarity, of garments that had been with a person through many seasons, and would, with luck and care, last through several more. In the deep heart of winter, when frost coated the edges of every roof tile, and the ground seemed to echo faintly underfoot with the hardness of frozen earth. Life in the rural villages of ancient China continued along its steady, deliberate path, for no matter how cold the wind blew or how long the night stretched, the work of living could not be set aside until spring. It had to be done each day with a rhythm shaped by necessity, custom, and the simple fact that animals still needed feeding, fires still needed tending, and people still needed to eat. The day began early, not because the warmth of the bed was easily abandoned, but because daylight was precious. In those few hours when the sun was highest could make the difference between work done in relative comfort and work done in bitter, biting cold. Rising from the Kong bed was often the hardest part of the day. The air beyond the quilt was sharp and heavy with chill, so most people dressed while still partly covered, pulling on layer after layer until they could face the room's cold without flinching, especially of the morning. Especially in the northern provinces, was to revive the fire in the stove or hearth, for its embers from the night before had often burned low. A few careful pokes with a stick, a handful of dry twigs, and the patient coaxing of the flame back to life were necessary before any cooking could begin. In homes with a Kong bed, the residual warmth from the flue below would linger, but it was no match for the air that seeped through walls and doors. As the fire was going, water had to be fetched, either drawn from a nearby well, or, in regions where streams and rivers froze over, hacked from the ice and carried back in buckets that left wet rings on the floor. This water was needed for cooking, for tea, and sometimes for washing. Though in the dead of winter, washing the body was done sparingly to avoid the shock of cold and the risk of illness. Instead, people might rinse hands and face quickly, saving full bathing for rare occasions when it could be done near a strong fire. Breakfast was simple but warm, often a porridge of millet or rice, sometimes mixed with bits of preserved vegetables or scraps of meat left from the night before. It's always served steaming so that the heat might spread through the body. After eating, each member of the household moved to their respective tasks. And though these varied by season, winter brought its own set of demands. For men, much of the outdoor work in the fields paused, as frozen ground could not be tilled, but there was still firewood to gather and chop, tools to repair, roofs to check for damage, and fences or pens to mend before livestock could be safely kept. Wood gathering was constant work in cold weather. Even a well-stocked pile could shrink faster than expected, and so men might travel into nearby groves or along the edges of the village, carrying axes and ropes to cut and haul back whatever they could find. In some places, dried reeds or straw were also collected to serve as supplementary fuel, especially for quick-burning fires to heat water. Livestock care was another unchanging responsibility. Animals had to be fed and watered daily, their stalls cleaned of waste to prevent illness, and in severe cold, extra bedding of straw or hay laid down to keep them warm. Chickens, pigs, goats, and sheep were common, and each required slightly different care. Hens needed grain and access to unfrozen water. Pigs were fed kitchen scraps, along with grain, mash. Goats and sheep were given stored fodder, sometimes supplemented with dried leaves collected in autumn. For women, winter days often meant long hours indoors, but not in idleness. The cold months were a time to spin yarn, weave cloth, sew and mend clothing, and prepare preserved foods. Spinning wheels creaked softly in many homes, turning raw fibers into thread that could be woven later. Quilting was a frequent task in winter, as extra layers were always needed for bedding and clothing. Food preparation also took on a special rhythm in winter, with pickled vegetables, dried meats, and fermented pastes brought out from storage to accompany the day's meals. Soy sauce, vinegar, and preserved radishes might flavor a midday dish. of noodles or dumplings, while dried fish could be simmered in soups. Midday, if the weather permitted, some work might be done outside the home, repairing baskets, cleaning storage areas, or checking field boundaries, but the cold often limited such tasks to short intervals. Afternoon light was softer, but brief, and as it began to fade, attention turned again to the fire, ensuring that enough fuel was brought indoors to last the night. Evenings in winter were longer than any other season, and so they became a time for communal indoor work, storytelling, and quiet companionship. Families gathered around the kang or the main hearth, each person with something in their hands, sowing dried beans, braiding straw into rope or sandals, and the talk would flow in slow, easy exchanges. Stories of ancestors, folk tales, or news from neighboring villages might be told, serving as both entertainment and the passing on of shared memory. For children, winter evenings were often a time of learning, as parents or elders might teach them simple characters, embroidery stitches, or the proper way to prepare a tool for spring planting. Lighting in these hours came from oil lamps or candles, their glow small but warm, casting shadows that shifted across the room. The sound of the wind outside was a constant backdrop, sometimes low and steady, sometimes rattling at the shutters with sudden bursts of force, reminding everyone that the cold waited just beyond the walls. Before sleeping, the household prepared the fire for the night. In some regions, ashes were piled over the embers to keep them smoldering until morning, reducing the need to restart the fire from scratch. Beds were piled with thick quilts, often made of multiple layers of fabrics stitched around cotton or wool. And sometimes heated stones or bricks were placed at the foot to chase away the first chill before climbing in. The Kong bed, for those who had it, would remain warm for hours after the fire below was banked, its gentle heat seeping through the brick platform. Sleep came early in winter, partly because darkness fell so soon, and partly because conserving lamp oil or candles was practical. Yet the day's work ensured that most people were ready for rest when night settled in fully. Life in winter was slower than in planting or harvest seasons, but it was never without purpose. Each task, no matter how small, played its role in keeping the household warm, fed, and ready for the year ahead. The routines repeated with little variation from day to day, creating a sense of stability in the face of the season's harshness. Though the cold was a constant presence, so too was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that through steady work and cooperation, a family could endure together, emerging into spring with health and strength intact. And so, in the long winter months, when snow sometimes lay thick over the land and the rivers froze in place, the people of these ancient villages moved through their days with patience, discipline, and the unspoken understanding that each log split, each garment mended, and each meal prepared was part of a chain of effort stretching back through countless winters before them and forward into the many more that would follow. In the midst of the long and often monotonous cold season, when the fields lay bare under a blanket of frost and the days seemed shorter than ever, ancient Chinese villages still found ways to weave joy and warmth into their lives through a variety of winter festivities and community gatherings that not only broke the routine of survival chores, but also strengthened the bonds that held neighbors together through the harshest months of the year. For even in a time when food had to be carefully rationed and warmth carefully preserved, there was a shared understanding that celebration, in whatever modest form it might take, was just as important to the health of the spirit as hot meals, and sturdy clothing were to the health of the body. And so these gatherings, often timed with traditional festivals or simply with moments when the village decided it was needed, carried with them the promise of laughter, storytelling, and shared comfort. One of the most significant occasions in the winter calendar was the celebration of the Lunar New Year, which fell at the end of the 12th lunar month and marked not only the turning of the year, but also the symbolic promise of spring's eventual return. And in preparation for this event, households would begin several weeks in advance to clean their homes from top to bottom, sweeping away dust and cobwebs in what was believed to be the removal of the old year's misfortunes, making space for the blessings and good fortune of the new year. This cleaning was not done in haste, but in a slow, methodical manner, often involving the entire family, with children tasked with carrying out light loads of sweepings and elders directing which corners needed more attention. Once the cleaning was complete, the focus shifted to decoration, and even in the poorest homes, a strip of red paper could be found to paste over the doorframe, for the color red was thought to ward off evil spirits and invite good luck, and, if the family could afford it, couplets, 2 long strips of red paper with calligraphy would be purchased or written by hand, containing poetic phrases wishing for prosperity, health, and peace in the year ahead. In the days leading up to the festival, communal preparation became a central activity. Its neighbors came together to help one another with labor-intensive cooking tasks, such as making dumplings, steaming buns, or preparing glutinous rice cakes, which in some regions symbolized the idea of rising higher each year. Large wooden or bamboo steamers would be set over the biggest kitchen fires, filling homes and streets with the comforting aroma of dough and savory fillings, and children often hovered nearby, eager for the moment when a dumpling might be slipped into their hands as a special treat before the official meal. On the evening of the Lunar New Year, families gathered for the most important feast of the year, a reunion dinner that brought together not only the immediate household, but also relatives from neighboring hamlets if the weather permitted. Safe travel dishes were plentiful by the standards of the time, featuring whatever had been preserved for the occasion, such as cured meats, pickled vegetables, dried mushrooms, occasionally fresh greens grown in sheltered plots or brought in from markets. After eating, the night might be spent in wakefulness to see in the new year, with elders telling stories from their youth or retelling folk tales passed down for generations. And sometimes, if the family was well off enough to afford them, small strings of firecrackers would be set off outside to frighten away malevolent forces, their sharp cracks echoing through the still winter air. Beyond the Lunar New Year, other winter gatherings were tied to smaller festivals or to agricultural rhythms, such as the Laba Festival, which occurred on the 8th day of the 12th lunar month and was traditionally associated with the preparation of laba porridge, a warm, thick mixture of grains, beans, dried fruits, and nuts, simmered for hours until flavors blended into a rich, comforting whole. The making of this porridge was often a communal act in villages, with neighbors contributing ingredients they could spare, creating a shared meal that symbolized unity and mutual support. Another form of gathering during winter came not from the calendar but from necessity, for when heavy snow fell and roads were blocked, villagers would often band together for cooperative labor, such as clearing paths, repairing damage to animal pens, helping a family whose roof had suffered under the weight of ice. These acts of collective work often ended with a shared pot of tea or soup consumed in the warmth of someone's main room, turning necessity into an occasion for conversation and fellowship. Evening entertainments during the winter also provided much-needed relief from the season's stillness. In some regions, itinerant storytellers or performers would travel from village to village, seeking shelter and food in exchange for reciting long tales or performing shadow plays. Their simple screens and oil lamps transforming walls into stages where legendary heroes, mischievous spirits, and ancient battles unfolded in shifting silhouettes. These performances, though modest, were eagerly anticipated, and the memory of them lingered long after the performers had moved on, becoming part of the village's own oral tradition. Music, too, found its place in winter gatherings. Simple instruments like flutes, drums, and stringed lutes could be brought out, and while the playing might be unpolished, the effect was nonetheless joyful. Songs often carrying familiar melodies that encouraged everyone to join in. Children's games, adapted to the season, were also part of community life, rolling hoops along snowy paths, sliding on frozen ponds, or playing guessing games indoors. Their laughter filling rooms where lamplight danced across faces. Weddings, though less common in winter due to travel difficulties, did sometimes occur in the cold months, particularly if an auspicious date was chosen according to the lunar calendar. And such events were among the most festive occasions a village could see, with feasts, music, and the exchange of gifts bringing life and warmth to the season. Even funerals, though somber, became a form of gathering, as they brought together extended kin and neighbors in shared rituals of mourning, offering a reminder that in all things joyful or sorrowful, the community stood together. One of the more subtle but deeply valued aspects of winter gatherings was the way they reinforced a sense of belonging, a reassurance that no one faced the season alone. Whether it was a shared meal, a group effort to prepare for a festival, or the simple act of spending an evening together by the fire. These moments created invisible threads of connection that bound the people to one another and to the land. They lived on. As winter slowly loosened its hold, these bonds would carry over into the busier months of planting and harvesting, their strength tested and proven during the cold, quiet weeks when survival depended as much on shared spirit as it did on individual labor. And so, in the rhythm of the ancient Chinese village year, winter was not merely a time of endurance, but also a season for renewal of relationships, for laughter that rose into the cold night air, for songs that echoed in memory, and for stories that stretched back through the generations, keeping alive the warmth of human connection until the first green shoots of spring appeared, carrying with them the promise that life, in all its shared richness, would begin its cycle anew. In the ancient Chinese countryside, when the frosts of late autumn signaled the end of the growing season, the challenge of ensuring that food would last through the long, often unpredictable months of winter became one of the most important priorities for every household. For without reliable preservation and storage techniques, the risk of hunger was constant, and so over countless generations, people developed a variety of ingenious, labor-intensive, and often communal methods to keep the fruits of their hard work from spoiling before spring returned, beginning first with the careful selection of which foods to preserve, since not everything grown in the warmer months could endure the long wait. And so vegetables like Chinese cabbage, radishes, turnips, and onions, grains like millet, wheat, and rice, and protein sources such as pork, fish, and occasionally poultry became the core of the winter stores, each handled according to its own needs. For while grains required dry, pest-proof storage, meats and vegetables often demanded more complex processes to prevent rot, mold, or loss of flavor. One of the most essential preservation methods was drying, a technique that relied on the combination of sunlight, wind, and low humidity to remove moisture from food, thus slowing the growth of bacteria and mold. And in the dry chill of northern winters, sliced radishes, long strips of pumpkin, and bundles of leafy greens could be hung from wooden racks outside, their colors slowly fading as they became leathery in texture, ready to be rehydrated months later in soups and stews. In southern regions where humidity was higher, drying often had to be done indoors, near warm hearths, or by placing food in slow ovens, fueled by crop waste or small sticks. Meat drying, particularly of pork and fish, was a specialized skill, for it required salting or marinating before being exposed to cold air, which not only prevented spoilage, but also infused the meat with flavors that became prized winter delicacies. And in villages near rivers or the sea, whole fish might be gutted, salted, and hung by their tails from bamboo poles, their silvery scales catching the pale winter sun until they became firm and ready for long-term storage. Salting itself was a preservation cornerstone, not only for meat, but also for vegetables. And large clay jars, filled with brine, would line the walls of storage rooms. Each jar holding layers of cabbage, mustard greens, or bamboo shoots submerged beneath heavy wooden lids weighted with stones. A process that transformed fresh produce into tangy, crisp pickles that could last for months and added much-needed variety to winter diets. In some areas, spices like star anise, ginger, and chili were added to the brine, giving the pickles distinctive regional flavors that became part of a community's culinary identity. Fermentation, closely related to pickling, was another widely used method, and beyond vegetables, it extended to soybeans, which could be turned into soy sauce, fermented bean pastes, or even preserved tofu, all of which provided valuable protein and seasoning in the months when fresh ingredients were scarce. And these fermentations required constant monitoring to ensure they progressed properly, with jars kept in places where temperatures were steady but cool, and their openings covered to keep out dust and insects while still allowing gases to escape. Grain storage, though it might seem straightforward, was in fact an art in itself. For pests such as rats, weevils, and moths were constant threats, and so grain was kept in sealed clay urns, woven bamboo bins coated with protective layers of mud, or raised wooden granaries with legs designed to prevent rodents from climbing. And households often mixed dried herbs or ashes into grain stores to deter insects, a practice that was passed down with as much importance as planting techniques themselves. Root cellaring, though not called by that name in ancient China, was another common strategy, particularly in northern and inland regions, where pits or underground rooms were dug to take advantage of the earth's stable, cold temperatures. And within these spaces, baskets of turnips, carrots, onions, and garlic could be kept fresh for months, their moisture loss slowed by the cool, dark environment, while cured meats and dried vegetables hung from rafters above. Ice storage, while less common and more labor-intensive, was practiced in wealthier households or by communities that had access to frozen rivers and lakes, where large blocks of ice would be cut in winter and stored in insulated pits lined with straw and sawdust, allowing them to be used for cooling foods well into the warmer months. Luxury that was sometimes reserved for preserving rare treats or for use in medicinal preparations. Smoke curing, another important preservation technique, combined drying and flavoring, and was particularly associated with pork, duck, and fish, which would be suspended above slow-burning fires of pine, fruit wood, or crop stalks, the aromatic smoke both deterring pests and imparting a deep, savory taste that made these foods highly anticipated parts of festival meals. The smoking process could take several days, during which the food had to be regularly checked, turned, and protected from sudden changes in weather. Community cooperation often played a role in preservation efforts, for some tasks were too demanding for a single household, and so villagers might gather to butcher a pig, with each family receiving a portion of fresh meat while helping to cure or salt the rest. Or they might pool resources to make large batches of fermented products, sharing both the work and the results. These gatherings were as much social events as they were practical necessities, providing an opportunity to exchange advice on preservation methods, share news, and strengthen bonds that would be vital in times of scarcity. Storage spaces themselves were carefully managed with regular inspections to remove any food that showed signs of spoilage, since one rotten cabbage could ruin a whole jar of pickles, and a single moldy grain sack could spread contamination to the rest. Thus, cleanliness, order, and vigilance were seen as integral parts of food preservation. And in many households, these responsibilities were assigned to the most experienced women or elders, whose knowledge of subtle signs of decay could mean the difference between a secure winter and an anxious one. Seasonal timing also played a role in preservation, for certain tasks were best done in specific weather conditions. Meat curing was often reserved for the coldest weeks when the risk of spoilage was lowest, while vegetable drying was done in late autumn, before the dampness of early winter set in, and fermentation projects were sometimes scheduled according to the lunar calendar, believed to influence the speed and quality of the process. Beyond the purely practical, food preservation also carried deep cultural and symbolic meaning, for the flavors of preserved foods became associated with the season itself. In the act of opening a jar of last year's pickles, or slicing into a piece of smoked pork, was not only a matter of nourishment, but also a reminder of the labor, cooperation, and foresight that had gone into making it possible. In this way, preservation was both a technical skill and a ritual of gratitude toward the land, the harvest, and the community that worked together to secure it. The end of winter, when the stores were finally running low, often brought a mixture of relief and pride. For surviving the season without hunger was a testament to the success of these methods, and even if the diet had grown monotonous by the last weeks, the knowledge that spring greens and fresh shoots were on their way kept spirits up. In the meantime, the last of the pickles, the final handfuls of grain, and the smallest cuts of dried meat would be carefully used to prepare meals that not only fed the body, but also marked the closing of another cycle of endurance and preparation, ready to be begun again when the next harvest season arrived. In ancient China, where winters could be harsh and unforgiving, especially in the northern plains and highland regions, the question of how to keep warm without the benefits of modern heating was one of the most vital concerns for both commoners and the wealthy, and over centuries, a vast body of knowledge emerged around clothing, layers, and the materials best suited to enduring long stretches of bitter cold. Knowledge that was not simply about personal comfort, but often a matter of life and death, because poorly chosen or insufficient clothing could lead to frostbite, illness, or even death during the coldest nights. And so, the crafting of winter garments became an essential skill in every household, passed down through generations, blending practical necessity with cultural traditions and aesthetic values. Beginning with the foundation of all winter wear, the choice of material. For the most common and accessible material for the majority of the population was cotton, which, though not native to all regions, became widely cultivated and prized for its warmth and softness once it spread. And cotton could be quilted into thick padded jackets, pants, and blankets, trapping air between its layers to provide insulation. While in wealthier households, silk, known for its lightness and remarkable ability to retain heat, was used either on its own or as a lining beneath heavier outer garments, making for clothing that was not only warm but also supple and elegant. But for those in the coldest regions, or with the means to afford it, fur was the ultimate winter defense, with pelts from sheep, fox, rabbit, or even more exotic animals like sable sewn into coats, hats, gloves, and boots. For fur not only trapped heat extremely effectively, but also blocked wind and shed snow, making it especially valuable for travel or work in exposed conditions. Yet, in the more resource-limited rural villages, people made do with what they had, often relying on multiple layers of hemp or homespun cloth, sometimes stuffed with whatever insulating material could be found, such as dried grass or plant fibers, which might not have been as soft or durable as cotton or silk, but still provided life-saving warmth. And the key to staying warm was not simply having thick clothing, but understanding how to layer garments effectively. 4 layers trapped air between them, and this air, warmed by the body, acted as an insulating barrier. So it was common for a person to wear a thin undergarment of silk or cotton closest to the skin to wick away moisture, a middle layer of padded cotton or hemp for insulation, and an outer layer of heavier, wind-resistant fabrics such as wool or fur to protect against the elements. The design of clothing also played a significant role in warmth retention, as loose-fitting garments could let in cold air, while overly tight clothing restricted movement and circulation. so most winter wear was tailored to fit comfortably close to the body without constriction, with collars designed to wrap snugly around the neck. Cuffs and hems, often reinforced or closed with ties to keep drafts out, and longer coats or robes extending well past the knees to shield the legs from the chill, while in some areas an additional apron-like wrap called a mian might be worn over the front for extra insulation. Footwear was a critical consideration in winter survival, but cold feet could quickly sap the body's overall warmth, and so thick-soled boots made from layers of cloth and leather, sometimes lined with felt or fur, became essential in northern regions, while in wetter southern winters, straw sandals or clogs with inner cloth wrappings provided both some insulation and the ability to dry quickly if they became damp. In the most frigid areas, boots were sometimes stuffed with dried grass, which acted as a surprisingly effective insulator and could be replaced easily when it became compressed or wet. Head coverings were equally important, as a significant amount of body heat could be lost through the head, and so hats made of fur, felt, or quilted cotton were worn even indoors in especially cold homes, often with ear flaps or ties under the chin to secure them against wind, and in particularly severe weather, scarves or face wraps were added to protect the nose and cheeks from frostbite. Gloves and mittens, though more common among those with resources, were also crafted from fur or thick cloth, and in many rural households, hands were instead kept warm by holding them inside sleeves or using hand warmers, small pouches filled with heated stones, sand, or even iron pellets that could retain warmth for hours and were often carried inside pockets or sleeves. The making of winter clothing was an annual task that began long before the first frost, as families would spend the warmer months spinning thread, weaving fabric, tanning hides, and sewing garments, with women often taking the lead in this work, ensuring that every member of the household had properly fitted clothes before the cold set in. These garments were not only practical, but also often decorated with embroidery, catered, stitching, or colorful trims, both as an expression of care and as a way to bring beauty into the otherwise bleak months. Repairs and maintenance were equally important, for winter clothing endured heavy wear, and torn seams, worn soles, or thinning insulation could quickly turn a warm garment into a liability. So patching and reinforcing clothing was a constant chore throughout the season. In wealthier urban areas, winter fashion also reflected social status, with elaborate fur-lined robes, brightly dyed silks, finely tailored coats indicating both wealth and access to high-quality materials, while poorer laborers might wear patched and repatched padded cotton jackets, so thick with layers of mending that they became stiff and heavy, but still effective against the cold. And this visual difference between rich and poor in winter dress was one of the most immediately noticeable markers of class in ancient society. Beyond individual clothing, group strategies for warmth were also common, such as sleeping under multiple heavy quilts in shared beds or heated brick platforms known as kang in northern China, which allowed people to sleep in lighter clothing at night while conserving their best garments for daytime use. Travelers in winter often carried extra wraps or cloaks, for even short journeys could be dangerous if weather conditions worsened unexpectedly. Hand traders or messengers crossing snowy landscapes sometimes wore heavy capes coated with oil to shed moisture and block wind. Special attention was given to children and the elderly, who were more vulnerable to cold, with extra layers, thicker padding, and warmer head coverings made for them first, reflecting a cultural emphasis on protecting the most fragile members of the household. The principles of winter clothing in ancient China layering, careful choice of materials, attention to fit, and regular maintenance were so deeply ingrained that they persisted even into later centuries, influencing traditional Chinese winter garments well into the modern era. And while the specific fabrics and styles might have evolved, the core understanding that warmth was best achieved through thoughtful preparation and skilled craftsmanship, remained unchanged. Ultimately, surviving the cold was not just a matter of owning warm clothes, but of understanding how to use them effectively. Combining them with other winter survival strategies such as proper shelter, adequate nutrition, and efficient heating. And those who mastered these skills not only endured the harshest months, but could even find comfort and dignity in the midst of winter's challenges. In the vast expanse of ancient China, where winter temperatures could drop to bone-chilling lows in the northern plains, the high plateaus of the west, and even the central river valleys during particularly harsh years, the problem of keeping a household warm was one of the most pressing challenges of daily life. For without effective heating methods, entire families could fall victim to the bitter cold. And so, over centuries, a wide range of heating techniques emerged, varying according to region, available resources, and social class, yet all guided by the same underlying principle: to retain as much warmth as possible in living spaces while making the most efficient use of fuel, which was often scarce and costly during the cold months. And perhaps the most famous and enduring of these heating methods was the Kong, a heated brick or clay platform bed widely used in northern China, which ingeniously combined sleeping and heating into one structure by allowing hot air and smoke from a small stove or firebox to travel through flues built into the base of the platform before exiting through a chimney, thus warming the entire surface so that the family could sleep in comfort even when icy winds rattled the walls outside. And this system was so efficient that it could maintain heat for hours after the fire had gone out, requiring less fuel than trying to heat an entire room. And in many households, the Kong became the central living area in winter, doubling as a space for eating, working, and socializing during the day, while serving as a communal bed at night, with thick quilts spread over its surface to trap the heat. In contrast, in the southern regions of China, where winters were often damp rather than deeply snowy, and where fuel sources like coal and firewood could be less plentiful, smaller and more portable heating devices were favored, such as the Huolu, a simple brazier made of clay, metal, or stone that could hold charcoal or wood embers, radiating heat outward while also allowing people to warm their hands and feet directly. And in some cases, families would carry the brazier from room to room as needed, though this required constant attention to prevent accidental fires or harmful smoke buildup. And speaking of portable heat, one of the most personal and beloved solutions in many households was the hand warmer or shoulu, a small metal container often beautifully crafted from brass or copper, with intricate patterns that could be filled with hot coals or heated stones, then carried inside sleeves or pockets to keep the hands warm. And similar in concept was the foot warmer, a wooden or ceramic box designed to be placed under a desk or quilt, sometimes divided into compartments so that different family members could share it without touching. And in more rustic settings, simple heated stones wrapped in cloth served the same purpose, placed in beds before sleeping to take the edge off the cold sheets. Larger-scale room heating in ancient China was often achieved through open hearths or enclosed stoves, with the design depending heavily on fuel availability. In areas rich in wood or bamboo, open fireplaces were sometimes built directly into the central hall of a home where the family could gather for warmth. While in coal-producing regions, especially in the north, enclosed stoves with chimneys were more common, not only because they made efficient use of coal's slow-burning properties, but also because they reduced the risk of smoke inhalation as a serious hazard in homes without proper ventilation. In wealthier homes, such stoves might be constructed from ceramic tiles, which held and radiated heat long after the fire was out, while in poorer homes, the stove might simply be a clay or stone structure patched together each winter as needed. Another ingenious method, particularly in rural farming areas, was the use of animal heat as a supplemental source of warmth. Livestock pens might be built adjacent to or beneath living quarters, allowing the heat generated by animals such as pigs, sheep, or cattle to rise into the home. And though this method was not without its odors and hygiene challenges, it could make the difference between freezing and staying warm during a hard winter. Ventilation was a constant concern, for while trapping heat was vital, the buildup of smoke from indoor fires could cause illness. So many traditional homes incorporated adjustable vents, smoke holes, or side chimneys to allow fumes to escape without losing too much heat. And in the most extreme climates, doors and windows were covered not only with wooden shutters, but also with oiled paper, cloth, or even rawhide to block drafts while still allowing in some light. The organization of household space also played a role in warmth retention, as families often lived in smaller, more enclosed rooms during winter, closing off unused spaces to concentrate the available heat, and in some cases, temporary inner walls made of fabric or reed mats were set up to reduce the volume of air that needed to be heated. Floors might be covered with thick mats, rushes, or even layers of straw to insulate against the cold ground. And sleeping arrangements were adjusted so that family members could share body heat, with the youngest and most vulnerable often placed between adults for added protection. Fuel conservation was a skill in itself, for gathering or purchasing enough firewood, charcoal, or coal to last a winter was a major task. And so, fires were often lit only at certain times of day, with the morning fire serving to prepare breakfast and warm the house, followed by a smaller midday heating for cooking, and then a longer burning evening fire to last through the night and to make the most of every scrap of fuel. Embers from one fire might be preserved in ash to be rekindled the next day, avoiding the need to start from scratch. In times of scarcity, dried crop residues, twigs, or even animal dung were pressed into service as fuel, each with its own burning qualities and challenges. In addition to physical heating, many households also relied on heat-preserving habits and clothing, employing multiple layers, even indoors, wrapping themselves in quilts while working or resting, and drinking hot teas, soups, and porridges too, warmed the body from within, with certain foods like ginger or lamb believed to have heating properties according to traditional Chinese medicine, making them especially popular in winter diets. Social customs also reflected the centrality of heating to winter life, as neighbors might gather around a shared brazier to talk, play games, or tell stories, and travelers stopping at roadside inns could count on finding a communal stove or kong to warm themselves before continuing on their journey. In some regions, festivals and winter gatherings were timed to coincide with the availability of extra fuel or the completion of seasonal tasks, ensuring that people could celebrate in relative comfort despite the cold. Over time, advances in craftsmanship and materials improved the efficiency and safety of heating devices, with better chimneys reducing smoke, more durable metals making braziers last longer, and finer textiles allowing for better insulation of both people and living spaces. Yet the underlying strategies remained much the same. Focus the heat where it was most needed, conserve fuel, insulate against the cold, and balance warmth with ventilation. For the wealthy, winter comfort could be almost luxurious, with private rooms heated by individual stoves, fur-lined seating, and even aromatic woods like sandalwood or camphor burned to scent the air. But for the poor, survival often depended on ingenuity, resilience, and a deep knowledge of how to stretch every scrap of warmth from the smallest fire. Thus, the art of heating in ancient China was not merely a technical skill, but a way of life, woven into the rhythms of the seasons, the design of homes, and the fabric of family and community. And even today, in rural areas where traditional methods persist alongside modern ones, the sight of a Kong bed or the feel of a warm hand, warmer still, connects people to a long heritage of ingenuity in the face of winter's cold. In ancient China, the arrival of winter was more than just a change of seasons. It was a shift in the rhythm of life, a period when survival depended not only on staying warm, but also on eating the right foods to maintain strength, energy, and resilience against illness. And the entire concept of a winter diet was deeply rooted in both practical necessity and the principles of traditional Chinese medicine, which taught that during the cold months, the body's yang energy needed to be nourished and fortified, while yin influences from the chill and dampness outside needed to be balanced through the consumption of warming, energy-rich foods. And because winter was also the season when fresh produce was scarce, careful planning during the warmer months was essential to ensure that households had enough preserved, dried, or stored food to last until spring. And so, across the empire, from the frigid far north to the milder southern provinces, families adapted their diets to the climate, their local crops, and their social status, creating a winter cuisine that was as much about preserving health as it was about satisfying hunger. At the heart of the winter diet in most regions were grains, for grain storage was the foundation of food security, and the choice of staple grain often reflected geography. In the north, wheat, millet, and sorghum dominated, stored as whole grains or ground into flour to make steamed buns, flatbreads, noodles, and dumplings. Could be easily cooked in boiling water or steamed over a fire, while in the south, rice remained the central staple, either kept as whole dried grains or processed into rice flour for cakes and kanji, a warm, nourishing porridge that could be flavored with vegetables, meats, or pickles to suit availability and taste. And in both regions, these grains were often prepared with hearty broths during winter to make them easier to digest and more effective at warming the body from within. Alongside grains, root vegetables such as turnips, radishes, yams, kale, and taro were common winter staples, prized for their ability to be stored in cool, dry conditions for months without spoiling. And their earthy, starchy qualities made them ideal for stews and soups. In colder regions, cabbages were often buried in pits or cellars to prevent freezing and could be eaten fresh or pickled throughout the season. Preserved mustard greens, salted radish strips, and fermented vegetables were valued for both flavor and their ability to stimulate the appetite when meals might otherwise become monotonous. Meat, though less common in the diets of the poor, played an important role in winter nutrition whenever it was available, and families who could afforded favored mutton, beef, pork, or game meats during the cold months because these were believed to be warming in nature. Mutton, in particular, was highly recommended in traditional medicine for its ability to strengthen the body's yang energy, and it was often cooked slowly with spices like cinnamon, star anise, ginger, and peppercorns to create rich, warming stews, while pork fat was rendered into lard for cooking, not only because it provided valuable calories, but also because it could be stored for months and used to enrich otherwise plain dishes. And in many northern households, sausages were cured. Meats were prepared in late autumn, hung from beams or rafters to dry in the cold air, and sliced thin for use in soups, stir-fries, or with rice and noodles. Fish, though more perishable, was preserved through salting, drying, or fermenting, with dried fish strips often rehydrated in hot soups. And in coastal areas, shellfish and seaweed could still be gathered during winter, adding variety and valuable nutrients to the diet. Eggs, when available, were preserved as salted eggs or century eggs, both of which could be eaten on their own or added to congee for extra flavor. Legumes, particularly soybeans, were another cornerstone of winter nutrition, both fresh and in processed forms such as tofu, soy sauce, and fermented bean pastes, all of which added protein and savory depth to winter dishes. And tofu, being highly adaptable, could be braised with meat, simmered in hot broth, or fried for a crisp texture, while fermented black beans were used to season hearty winter meals. The use of warming spices and condiments was a defining feature of winter cooking. Not only for taste, but for their supposed medicinal properties. Ginger was considered essential, added to soups, teas, and stir-fries for its ability to promote circulation and dispel cold from the body. While garlic was used both for flavor and for its perceived power to prevent illness, other common seasonings included scallions, chili peppers, Sichuan peppercorns, and various aromatic herbs, all of which were thought to warm the internal organs and stimulate appetite during the slow, cold months. Preservation was the key to variety in winter diets, and techniques such as drying, salting, fermenting, and pickling allowed households to enjoy foods that would otherwise have been impossible to obtain until spring. In the north, large clay jars filled with pickled vegetables were kept in storage rooms, their flavors deepening over time, while in the south, sweet and savory preserved fruits such as plums, kumquats, and tangerine peel were eaten as snacks, or used to flavor teas and medicinal brews. And tea itself remained a vital part of winter life, with darker, fermented varieties such as pu'er or oolong preferred for their warming qualities. Sometimes brewed with slices of ginger, dried longan, or red dates to create both a comforting beverage and a mild tonic for the blood and energy. The concept of seasonal eating was deeply ingrained in ancient Chinese thought, and winter meals were often designed to be heavier, richer, and higher in fats and proteins than those in summer, reflecting the belief that the body needed more concentrated nourishment to endure the cold. Communal meals were also an important aspect of winter life, as sharing a hot pot or a large stew around the family hearth not only made efficient use of fuel, but also strengthened social bonds, and in wealthier households, elaborate winter banquets featured delicacies such as roasted duck, braised abalone, and delicately prepared soups with medicinal herbs like ginseng or angelica root, which were believed to strengthen vitality and prolong life. In poorer households, ingenuity often replaced luxury, and a single chicken might be stewed with turnips and cabbage to feed an entire family, with the broth stretched over several days by adding noodles or dumplings. Rice porridge, flavored with just a few preserved vegetables or a spoonful of lard, was a common breakfast, while flatbreads or steamed buns with pickles might serve as lunch and for dinner. A pot of bean curd with chili oil could provide warmth and sustenance even on the coldest nights. Seasonal festivals also influenced the winter diet, with the winter solstice, Dongsi, being a particularly important time for eating special foods believed to increase health and fortune. In the north, families made dumplings shaped like ears, symbolizing protection against frostbite, while in the south, glutinous rice balls filled with sweet bean paste or black sesame were eaten in hot broth, symbolizing unity and warmth within the family. The emphasis on warmth in winter foods extended beyond temperature to texture and density, with slow-cooked dishes favored for their heartiness. In meals, oftentimes, so that the largest, most substantial meal was eaten in the evening when the cold was most intense. The idea was to allow the body to digest while resting, using the nutrients to replenish energy reserves overnight. Beyond physical nourishment, the flavors, aromas, and rituals of winter eating provided emotional comfort, lifting spirits during the long dark nights and reinforcing the sense of continuity between generations. Its recipes and preservation techniques were passed down within families, adapted slightly, but always retaining the core principles that had sustained communities for centuries. Thus, the winter diet of ancient China was not just a matter of food, but a holistic approach to seasonal living, integrating practical storage methods, medicinal theory, and cultural tradition into a way of eating that both sustained life and enriched it, reminding people that even in the harshest season, warmth could be created not only by fire, but also by the shared experience of a well-cooked meal. As the long winter of ancient China began to loosen its grip, the days slowly lengthened, and the first signs of seasonal change stirred both the earth and the hearts of the people. Yet, the transition from deep cold to the first whispers of warmth was never sudden, for winter did not vanish in a single breath, but instead lingered with quiet persistence, a guest reluctant to leave. And so the people remained vigilant, continuing the rituals, habits, and careful living that had carried them through the months of frost, knowing that nature often gave moments of hope only to test endurance once more. And it was in this delicate balance between patience and anticipation that the wisdom of generations revealed itself most clearly, teaching that every season's close was not an ending, but a preparation for what came next. And in villages scattered across the empire, life followed this rhythm as predictably as the moon's phases. The elders reminding the young that rushing toward spring could invite misfortune, for the body and spirit must adjust as slowly as the soil itself warmed beneath the sun's returning touch. And so the diet remained hearty, but began to lighten. Fires still burned in hearts, but embers glowed rather than roared, and people used the last of their preserved vegetables and grains while eyeing the stored seeds that would soon find their place in the earth. A quiet reminder that every meal, every layer of clothing, every moment of warmth in winter was only possible because of preparation made long before the first snow had fallen. It was during this closing chapter of the season that communities often came together more closely. For by now, the winter's solitude and stillness had brought both reflection and longing for more lively days. And as the Lunar New Year approached, families busied themselves with cleaning their homes, not merely to remove the soot and dust that had gathered during the months of indoor living, but to symbolically sweep away the old year's hardships and open the door to good fortune. And in this period, food, clothing, and customs all reflected the dual nature of the time, both the last embrace of winter and the first welcome of spring, as bowls of warming congee still sat steaming on tables, while the first tender greens, if the weather allowed, were plucked from gardens or bought in markets and added to meals as a promise of renewal. The fields, once buried in snow or hardened by frost, began to change slowly, and farmers tested the soil, sometimes scattering ash from the hearths across the frozen ground to help it thaw and enrich it for planting. While in warmer southern regions, early sowing might begin, the rhythmic sound of hoes breaking the earth mingling with birdsong that had been absent for many months still clung stubbornly to shaded paths, while streams, once silenced by ice, now sang again as meltwater trickled down into rivers, carrying with it both sealed for the crops and the message that life was stirring beneath the surface. In the towns, markets grew busier, not yet overflowing with abundance, but rich in the variety that had been absent during the heart of winter. Baskets of preserved goods sat beside fresh fish from thawing waters, and stalls displayed dried meats alongside the first bunches of scallions, spinach, and other cool weather greens, their vibrant color breaking the monotony of winter's pale palette. And the people's clothing, though still layered, began to shift from the heaviest furs and thick padded robes to lighter, quilted garments, though no one was careless enough to be caught without at least one layer of wool or cotton batting. For a sudden, cold wind could undo the comfort of a sunny morning in a heartbeat. In the evenings, the gatherings around the hearth grew more spirited, for now there was talk of planting, of repairing fishing nets, of mending tools, and of arranging marriages and community agreements that would be acted upon when travel became easier, and children, no longer content to remain indoors, ran to the courtyards or village lanes to play, their laughter mingling with the sound of crackling wood as the fires burned lower and more intermittently, though still kept alive enough to ward off the chill that came when the sun slipped away, for winter's shadow was slow to retreat entirely. This was also the time when the elders shared their final winter tales, stories passed down through countless winters before. Each one meant not just to entertain, but to teach, to remind the younger generation of the resilience, patience, and harmony with nature that sustained life in the harshest months. And these tales often carried a deeper meaning now, for with the promise of spring came the responsibility of planting wisely, of tending not only to fields, but to relationships and duties, as life outside the home would soon demand as much attention as the hearth had in winter. In wealthier households, the end of winter was marked with feasts that blended the last of the rich preserved foods with the first fresh harvests, and such meals symbolized both gratitude for what had sustained them and hope for what was to come. Duck braised with winter bamboo shoots, pork stewed with the last pickled mustard greens, fish steamed with fresh ginger and scallions, and bowls of noodles to represent longevity would appear on tables surrounded by family members dressed in their best clothes, red banners and lanterns brightening the still muted light of late winter days. In humbler homes, there might be only a pot of porridge with fresh herbs or a simple stir-fry of greens and bean curd. But even this carried the same joy, for it marked the moment when the long months of relying solely on stored provisions had passed, and the first fresh taste of the earth's renewal had arrived, however small. The transition between winter and spring was also a spiritual one, for many temples held ceremonies to honor deities of agriculture, rivers, and the hearth, asking for favorable weather, protection from floods, and a good harvest, and offerings of incense, fruit, and symbolic paper goods were made with sincerity, as the people understood that their well-being was tied not only to their own efforts, but to the will of the natural and spiritual forces that governed the world. As the final days of winter faded, there was a sense of both relief and quiet pride among the people, for they had endured, once again, the season of scarcity and cold, and they had done so through foresight, hard work, and the bonds of family and community. And now the world would ask of them a different kind of labor, one not of guarding against loss, but of striving toward growth. And in that shift was a kind of joy that words could barely capture, a joy felt in the warmth of the sun on one's back, in the green shoots pushing through the soil, in the sound of children chasing each other over thawing ground, and in the knowledge that the hardships of the season had not only been survived, but had, in their own way, strengthened the spirit for the year to come. Thus, the cycle of the seasons continued, as it always had, each ending folding seamlessly into a beginning. And those who had listened to the wisdom of their elders, who had preserved food carefully, dressed wisely, and lived in harmony with the demands of the cold, now found themselves ready to meet the demands of warmth and growth. And this readiness was perhaps the truest gift of winter, not merely the endurance it required, but the preparation it offered for everything that lay ahead. And so the story of winter in ancient China closes not with a single moment, but with the slow unfurling of life into spring, a reminder that every hardship holds within it the seed of renewal, waiting only for its proper time to emerge, just as the earth, after months of stillness, now began to breathe again under the gentle but certain touch of the returning sun. Good night.